Hey kids, it's Papa. You ready to explore the Bible? All right, well, let's take a look at, I think it's Friday today, and we're going to take our Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to look at the ark, but we're not only going to look at the ark today, but also all of the animals that got put into the ark. And so turn with me to Genesis chapter 6, and starting in verse 17, it says, "And behold, I, even I," this is God now speaking, "I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and every living thing that in the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant, then thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee, and of every living thing of all flesh, two of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee, and they shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, two of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. And thou shalt take unto thee of all the food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, thou shalt and it shall be for food for thee and for them." So here's what happened. God said, I'm going to bring every type of animal on earth. Now, we're going to see later on that every animal in which whose nostrils was the breath of life. In other words, air-breathing animals. Now you say, wait a minute, what are you talking about, air-breathing animals? Well, there's a lot of animals that don't breathe air. Well, they use oxygen, but they don't breathe it. Like, for instance, fish and all of the animals that are swimming around the oceans. There didn't need to be any whales in the ark. There didn't need to be any mackerels or swordfish or octopuses, because they live in the water just fine, and they could survive just fine. But all of the animals that are out walking around on the earth that breathe air, they had to be in the ark. Now you say, wait a minute here, the ark wouldn't be big enough. Think about all of the different types of animals. Yeah, but all of the different types of animals, and he talks about every animal after his kind. Like, for instance, did there need to be a Chihuahua and a Great Dane and a Cocker Spaniel and a Labrador Retriever? No, those are all dogs. Wolves and all of those animals, they all come from the same family. It's interesting. You go down to the Caribbean, and hopefully we get to go in February, but you will see island dogs. They all look the same. Why? Because they all came from the same stock. Now, we have divided and we have created all of these different types of dogs, but they're all basically dog, and they're basically cat, and they're basically... So all of these animals are really just, they came from two animals. And so the animal kinds. Now, keep in mind, a dog can't breed with a cat because they're different kinds. But the different types of animals, that number is still huge. There's still a whole lot of different animals. But if you take the average size, they figured this out, that the average size would be about the size of a sheep. And so if you try to figure out, do we have enough space on the ark for this many different sheep, then the answer would be yes. And actually, they had not only enough space on the ark, but they had more than enough space. They had to have more than enough space because, keep in mind, he said that you're going to bring food on this ark for basically a year of you living on the ark. Now, that means that they had to bring enough grain, enough silage, enough grass, enough all of this stuff for the animals to eat. And also, I need to point out that the animals back then didn't eat meat. There was no meat being eaten until after the flood, and we'll talk about that later. And so you wouldn't have to bring, refrigerators on they didn't have refrigerators. But all of these were herbivores. You know what a herbivore is? That's someone that eats herb. It means they eat plants. And so all of these animals ate plants, and so it would be easier to store the food for the animals. But also, another thing you need to understand that is every animal has some form of hibernation. And so these animals didn't necessarily have to be awake the whole time. They could go to sleep and do just fine sleeping the majority of the time that they were there, and God could slow them down. Another thing is that animals didn't have to be full grown. Now think about it for a moment. You could bring on a calf instead of a full-blown cow. You could bring on puppies instead of full-grown dogs. You could bring on smaller elephants rather than full-grown elephants, and small giraffes instead of full-grown giraffes. But also back then there were dinosaurs as well. You say, wait a minute, yeah, there were dinosaurs back then. And so these full-grown lizards didn't need to come on the ark. They could have smaller, not babies, but smaller lizards. And so it didn't need to be quite as huge as a lot of people think. And so this ark was more than enough for God to bring 2 of these on. You say, how did Noah and his family gather all these animals? They didn't have to. The Bible's very clear that God brought these animals on board. Can you imagine? Think about that. Noah got the ark finished, and suddenly all of these animals started coming 2 by 2 and walking up and getting into the ark and getting into their cages and saying, I think I'm going to take a nap now. Can you imagine how that had to have looked? And also, I want you to realize that, remember all of the people standing around watching as these animals came 2 by 2. I mean, think about it. For 120 years, Noah said these animals were going to come and that this ark was going to be built, and suddenly it was. Think about what these people had to have thought, and yet they still didn't get on the ark. And that's a shame. Now, some questions you might want to remember. How many of each animal came on the ark? 2. Now, there were some exceptions to that, and we're going to talk about that later. But the animals came 2 by 2. And what animal was the average size of all of the animals? Well, probably a sheep. And they could have slept. And they didn't have to eat meat because they were herbivores. Now, these are all things you might want to remember for the quiz that's coming up. Yeah. Anyway, well, love you guys, and we'll talk to you on Monday. See you later. Bye-bye.